Only in America.
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 This week, one of the smartest people I've ever met describes why an undervalued and often marginalized workforce is also one of our nation's most important.
And I've seen the incredible resilience of the women that I work with every day who, despite being undervalued and underpaid and not having access to benefits and struggling to take care of your own family, you go to work every day and you put your heart and soul into caring for the people that you work for. And you take an enormous amount of pride and dignity. There's so much strength in that is an inspiration to me. And if we have that kind of human capacity, I think we can do anything.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Noorani, and this is Only in America. When we talk about immigrant contributions to the U.S., we often frame the conversation around exceptional examples. Immigrants who build business empires, win prestigious awards, or develop innovative technology. But the everyday contributions of those in less visible industries, in my opinion, are most important, but the least valued. Domestic work, whether as a caretaker, a housekeeper, or a nanny, may not typically be lauded as proof of immigrant contributions, but it's one of the best examples of how immigrants sustain our society. How we invest in the domestic workforce will continue to be key as our nation ages. So, how does this all relate to immigration? Well, a new report by the Clean Slate for Worker Power, a project of Harvard Law School's Labor and Work-Life program, gives some insight. The report points out that 95% of U.S. domestic workers are women, foreign-born, or women of color. The report also points out that labor historically performed by women and people of color, such as caregiving, has long been undervalued. The issue is compounded by immigration status, as undocumented workers are vulnerable to exploitation by employers, a problem that's especially prevalent for domestic work, which has the largest percentage of undocumented workers of any industry. Then and now, the report reads, race, gender, national origin, and immigration status matter when it comes to determining whose work is considered worthy of rights, dignity, and protection under the law. We need to recognize the importance and dignity of domestic work and ensure workers are treated and compensated fairly. It's essential not only for our country's economic success, but our upholding of our value of justice for all.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
"2020 marks the 10-year anniversary of the first Domestic Workers' Bill of Rights, first passed in New York in 2010. The bill guarantees basic labor protections like paid time off and coverage under the state's human rights law for domestic workers. For Aijen Poo, the anniversary is an important reminder of the triumphs of the last decade and the challenges domestic workers and their advocates still face. Aijen leads the National Domestic Workers Alliance, a nonprofit that describes itself as working to bring quality work, dignity, and fairness to the growing numbers of workers who care and clean in our homes, the majority of whom are immigrants and women of color. Now, thanks to the work of the Alliance, over recent years the stories of domestic workers have become a larger part of the public narrative. From the award-winning 2019 movie Roma to high-profile support from stars like Meryl Streep, we are beginning to better understand the valuable contributions of domestic workers to our everyday lives. And as Aijen pointed out, the very nature of domestic work means a large portion of America's undocumented population is deeply embedded in intimate parts of many Americans' lives, an interdependence that directly contradicts the perception of immigrants as a burdensome other that is separate from the rest of America. And during times of crisis, this interdependence becomes all the more clear. Whether it was the domestic workers, nannies, and other caregivers who braved the California wildfires to return to their places of work, or the personal care attendants, nursing home staff, or home healthcare aides who are on the front lines of the fight against coronavirus. As Aijen wrote in a recent New York Times op-ed, domestic workers have long been a part of our national emergency response team. In each crisis, they bear the responsibility of taking care of our homes and families, while our federal government fails to protect us from increasingly intense and frequent disasters. The least we can do is care for them too. Aijen and I spoke about recognizing the diversity of our workforce needs, the vulnerability of a polarized America, and how to champion solutions that will benefit every American family by valuing all workers. Aijen, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. It's really great to talk to you.
I have been a long time admirer of everything that you've done, so I'm really excited for this conversation. So I really, really appreciate it. Before we dig into the work at the Domestic Workers Alliance, let's talk about you for a second. What led you to this work?
It was partly because being in an immigrant family that was also intergenerational, the kind of intergenerational caregiving culture that I was surrounded by that really raised me is a huge part of who I am and a huge part of the way that I look at the world. And, as I got older, I think I sort of realized that the incredibly important role that caregivers play in our lives isn't really valued. And that until we address that really core issue and support the people who make everything else possible in our lives, we will always be teetering on unsustainability. And so I think just knowing how much my grandmother and my mother and the many, many other people who cared for me along the way are a part of who I am today and how valuable that is, and wanting that value to be really reflected back in society as a whole, I think is a big part of it.
And was there a moment when you said, you know what, I've got to start this organization?
No, it's so interesting. There was never that moment. I never really thought of myself as a leader or a starter. I just kind of found myself with groups of women who were really passionate and who were about solving problems and who really took responsibility for their own roles in making their lives better and making their communities better. So I first started as a volunteer with a group of Filipina domestic workers who I had met as a volunteer at the Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. And they really wanted to organize. They saw the value of coming together as a collective because they were so isolated in their workplaces. And then they really said, we've got to organize in other communities and bring in all the Caribbean women and the Latinas who are also doing this work. And it just kept growing and growing from there. But it was never singular in terms of my idea. It was always a group of women who made it all happen through the power of the collective.
So unpack for me the role of the immigrant community within the domestic worker community.
Yeah. Well, so the domestic workforce, so when I say domestic worker, I'm talking about nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers, basically anyone who works in our homes doing caregiving or cleaning work. And it's disproportionately women of color doing that work and many, many immigrant women. And in fact, this workforce is the part of the economy with the largest concentration of undocumented immigrants of any industry in the US workforce. So contrary to a lot of the mythology that you might hear on Fox News, the truth is that immigrants are caregivers. They're in our homes. They're taking care of the most precious elements of our lives every single day, and they're deeply embedded in the fabric of our families.
So a number of years ago, the political analyst Ron Brownstein, who writes for The Atlantic and for CNN, he coined this term of gray versus brown elections, where, senior citizens who were afraid of the demographic change, the cultural change, the economic change that comes with immigration, were in essence kind of pitted against the younger, more diverse electorate. But it seems like when you look at the domestic workforce and that connection between, the boomers and immigrants, documented or not, it's a gray needs brown type of dynamic. And you've written about this in some different in different places, but what are your thoughts on the gray versus brown, or is it gray needs brown?
It's probably both and more complex than that even. Here's what I'll say is that right now this country is undergoing a massive demographic shift, and most people think about it in terms of race, that we have this growing population of Latinx and Black and Asian people of color who are fast becoming the majority. But the demographic shift that I've been obsessed with, layered on top of that, is the aging of America and the fact that every 8 seconds someone turns 70 in America, with the boomers aging. And because of advances in healthcare and technology, people are living way longer than ever before, way longer than we ever would have imagined when we put our safety net into place. And we've essentially added an entire generation onto our lifespan, but we've adapted none of our policies or our programs and systems or our culture to shift, to adapt to that, and to really design for that lengthened period of time. And a big part of what we need in terms of the systems and the infrastructure in place is about caregiving, because as people age, they also have chronic illnesses, they become more frail, they develop disabilities, and they require more care and more supportive services. And so that huge need, right? We need more care for the elderly than ever before at a time when we have less of it, because more and more, whereas we used to, our default care system was women. Women were expected to stay at home. And that hasn't been our reality for decades. And so we need a really strong caregiving workforce to support that growing aging population, which also happens to be much wider. And there is no way, no literal way, that we will be able to meet that need for care without a huge amount of immigrant workers. There's just simply there's no way around it. And that creates a dynamic. It's an opportunity from my standpoint to really look at how we invest in our caregiving systems, including our human infrastructure, which is going to be a large part immigrant. But it's really an all hands on deck situation. If we're going to take care of all the people that we love who raised us, like our parents and our grandparents, we're going to need to really invest in the immigrants who are going to be a part of that solution. And it's complicated for many, many people who don't see that need or refuse to acknowledge that need and the inherent interdependence there. And I'll say that, Arizona is the state in the country that is the most racially and generationally polarized at the moment. And to your earlier point, which means racially and generationally polarized, just meaning that we have the largest concentration of white people over the age of 65 and the largest group of people of color under the age of 18 in the state of Arizona. And it is no accident to me that the state of Arizona is the birthplace of SB 1070, the notorious anti-immigrant legislation that spread throughout the South, that really was the beginning of, or really catalyzed an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment and reflected back an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment. I do think that Arizona is a canary in the coal mine if we don't look really deeply at this question of how we are so interdependent. We are definitely vulnerable in that context of racial and generational polarization to be pulled further apart, when actually what it means is that we're more interdependent than ever before. And if we actually embrace that and design for it, we can all live better.
So where does perception fit into this? And what I'm getting at here is the perception of domestic work as unskilled and undignified, therefore something that we don't as a society value. Is that then exacerbated by the country's immigration debate?
Yes, I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't value domestic work and caregiving work. And it does have to do with a hierarchy of human value that really structures our world. We do live in a world that is designed to value and recognize the contributions of men over women, of white people over people of color. And I don't mean it to be oversimplistic, but I do think that our culture reflects those hierarchies, and immigrants are another layer of that. And so I think that if we are to really get at the kind of cultural norms and beliefs that devalue domestic work, we're going to have to really unpack and undo all the ways in which we value the lives of some people over others.
And in the role of the caregiver, because in some ways, that's such an incredibly personal relationship that's developed. How are you more or less kind of taking those examples and helping the broader public understand that this is a nurturing, caring relationship, partnership between the caregiver and the person that they work with every day?
Well, what's interesting about that is that more and more people are taking care of their own family members. And, I think we have something like 50 some million working family caregivers who are working full-time jobs and taking care of elderly loved ones. And so they know how difficult caregiving is. And so there's this increased awareness, and they know how isolating it can be. And I think the future is an interconnectedness, a greater sense of connection between family caregivers who are really struggling to manage care for their own family members and the caregiving workforce that's part of their squad, that's backing them up, that's showing up to relieve them and help them, and all of us being on the same caregiving team. I mean, I do think that if we put the people we love at the center, and we think about the project of the 21st century is how do we make sure that everyone we love has the care and the support they deserve to live well at every stage of life and to realize their potential, if it's about children, or to live and age with dignity and have as much independence as possible for as long as possible. That if we design for that, we'll see how there's no way to do it separate and apart from each other. We have to be on the same care squads. We need each other in that project. And it might just be the one thing that's important enough to us to help us really see that across all the differences that we've internalized, or the kinds of ways that we've internalized stories about each other that keep us apart.
I never thought about that because of that number of folks who are caring for their own elders and their own family. I mean, do you have a story of kind of when somebody has realized that how their caregiver squad is helping them survive in so many ways?
I mean, it's happening right now with my own family. My mom she retired a year and some ago, and she is caring full-time for my 94-year-old grandmother now. And it's not at all how she imagined her retirement, but here she is, in her early 70s, spending her days and nights caring for a 94-year-old woman. And she now has to have 24-hour home care support, and it takes two of them because my grandmother is increasingly immobile and she's heavy and needs to be lifted in and out of seats and in and out of bed. And she needs a lot of assistance, and it is not safe for my mom to care for her alone. And watching my mom and the caregivers work together as a team, I mean, you really do see it. And when I'm there, I'm part of the squad. My sister, who lives 3 blocks away, is part of the squad. My 4-year-old niece is part of the squad. We all help. And we're all bonded by this mission of ensuring that my grandmother can live with as much dignity as humanly possible for as long as possible. And that is a bond that is powerful, that connects us, and the role that the caregiver plays in that context, the home care worker, is so, so key. Her name is LaDawn, and she is a godsend. I mean, literally, my mom wants to cry when she, it's just like having the support to be able to actually get a good night's sleep as a caregiver. There's nothing more valuable.
So a lot of this is and I think you've gotten at this a little bit, where it's a very, very individual relationship that you're trying to understand and then change the system around those relationships and that caregiving. But you've also had some significant victories at the state level in terms of addressing the systemic challenges. Can you tell me some of what those changes were and what changes they led to in caregivers' lives?
Yeah. So, this year is actually 2020 is the 10th anniversary of the passage of the first Domestic Worker Bill of Rights in New York State. In New York, we organized for 7 years to pass legislation that would establish basic rights and protections, including 3 days paid leave for domestic workers in the state of New York. Can you imagine? We had to fight for 7 years to get 3 days paid time off.
Wow.
But an inclusion in very old labor laws. But we did, and it set a historic precedent, and it sent a message that domestic workers have rights, and this is real work equal to any other form of work. These are professionals who take enormous pride in the work that they do, and they work incredibly hard, and they should be able to take care of their own families on the income that they earn. And that kind of set off a wave, and over the course of the last decade, 9 additional states have passed domestic worker bills, and 2 cities, the city of Seattle and the city of Philadelphia, which we're really proud of. Philadelphia's bill created portable paid time off for 16,000 domestic workers in the city, the first bill of its kind. So we're really proud of the progress we made. And even under the Obama administration, we made a huge historic breakthrough when we worked with the Department of Labor to make a regulatory change that brought 3 million home care workers under minimum wage protections for the first time. Literally before that measure was implemented, it was perfectly legal to pay home care workers below the minimum wage in a number of states. Can you imagine?
Unbelievable.
Yeah. So we've made progress, but it's not enough. Minimum wage is not enough to survive. It's not enough to raise a family. Right now, the average income of a home care worker is $15,000 per year. And this is the fastest growing occupation in our whole economy. So we've got a lot of work to do to make these jobs really good jobs, both so that the people who do them can sustain in them, and so that people like my grandmother and my mom can get the support that they deserve. And a big part of that is going to be really ensuring that the immigrant workforce is a part of the solution and feels like we are investing and in their sustainability and their ability to be a part of this workforce.
So when you go and talk to a U.S. Senator, and I just looked this up, it turns out the average age of the current U.S. Senate is 61.8 years old. So they're, let's just say a number of them are nearing retirement, whether or not they realize it. So let's say we're having this conversation, in the front of the U.S. Senate. What is the message you would deliver them so that they understand the contributions of the immigrant to the domestic workforce, the potential of the immigrant? So what's that message?
The message to me is that we have a huge challenge ahead of us in terms of meeting the caregiving needs of working families in America. And we need bold solutions and creative approaches to meeting that challenge. And if we do, the kind of human potential that unlocks in the United States is really quite profound. And it is an opportunity waiting to be seized. And I think it's the responsibility of this generation of elected leaders to really put that bold solution in place that allows us to invest in our caregiving systems, our caregiving workforce, and do so in a way that recognizes the full diversity of the workforce that we need.
So you have been doing this work for a long time. It is clearly a pretty challenging political moment in the nation's history, and you work with one of the most marginalized workforces in our country. So I got to ask, what gives you hope every day?
What gives me hope is that we keep winning and that organizing actually works. And I know it probably to most people who are listening to your podcast are thinking like, okay, she's crazy because we're not winning. But I will say, when we started organizing domestic workers, people said that's impossible. Domestic workers cannot be organized. And when we introduced a domestic worker bill of rights in New York State, people said, that is not possible. There's no way you're going to win a Bill of Rights for domestic workers. Here we are 10 states later. We have 280,000 domestic workers in our community, and we keep growing. And we have changed lives through our advocacy and through working together. And I believe that we have solutions that will benefit every single American family, and that we have a responsibility to champion them. And I've seen the incredible resilience of the women that I work with every day who, despite being undervalued and underpaid and not having access to benefits and struggling to take care of your own family, you go to work every day and you put your heart and soul into caring for the people that you work for. And you take an enormous amount of pride and dignity. There's so much strength in that is an inspiration to me. And if we have that kind of human capacity, I think we can do anything. And our movement's been harnessing it to really change policy and change culture and systems. And I think that it's a little window into what would be possible if we all across this country came together, whether it's around caregiving or around the future of work or whatever the issue may be. We only solve them together. And when we come together, we see what is possible in a totally different light.
I couldn't agree more. And I have only one more question for you. I have many more questions for you, but I have to let you go at some point. My last question for you is something I ask all of the guests, is that just to finish this sentence. And the sentence is, only in America, ...
Ooh, only in America do we have the opportunity to knit this incredibly diverse experiment in democracy together with care.
Aijen, you are a person I've admired for a long time. You were one of my heroes. I want to be you when I grow up.
That's nice of you, Holly. I don't think so.
I mean, most people who know me know that I'm never going to grow up, so you have nothing to worry about. But I really appreciate this time, and thank you for everything you do, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. It's been fun talking to you.
Aijen Poo is the co-founder and executive director of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. You can find more information about Aijen and the Alliance at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And while you're there, subscribe to Only in America to catch all the latest episodes. Tune in next week for a preview of our next series, Growing a Better System. We'll hear from voices across the agricultural industry about the realities the farm workers face and how our current immigration laws fail to satisfy our nation's appetite. Only in America is produced and edited by Joanna Taylor and Megan Wetmore. I'm Ali Noorani, and I will talk to you next week.